November 19th, 1942, the day German generals knew Stalingrad was lost. November 19th, 1942, 7:15 a.m. The temperature hovered at -20 degrees Celsius as a thick fog blanketed the Don steppe northwest of Stalingrad. Colonel Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 6th Army's 94th Infantry Division stood in his command bunker, warming his hands over a small stove as he reviewed reconnaissance reports. His Romanian allies in the 3rd Army had been reporting unusual Soviet troop movements for days, but Hoffmann, like many German officers, had dismissed these concerns. "The Russians are exhausted," he confidently told his adjutant, Lieutenant Hans Kramer. "By spring, Stalingrad will be a footnote in our glorious campaign east." In 5 minutes, the opening salvos of Operation Uranus would prove how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolds over the next 72 hours will not merely change the fate of the German 6th Army, but transform these officers' understanding of modern warfare itself. They entered November 19th believing in German technical and tactical superiority. They would end it confronting the devastating reality of industrial warfare on a scale they never imagined possible. Major General Ferdinand Heim, commander of the XLVI Panzer Corps, jolted awake at the sound of distant thunder. Except it wasn't thunder, it was the unmistakable roar of Katyusha rockets. The Major General quickly pulled on his uniform and rushed outside his headquarters near the village of Bolshoi. The morning darkness was intermittently broken by flashes of light to the north, where the Romanian 3rd Army held the flank. A staff officer approached, his face ashen in the dim light. "Her General, reports from Romanian forward positions indicate a massive artillery barrage along a 50-kilometer front. Communications with several regiments have been completely lost." Heim's stomach tightened. His 22nd Panzer Division, nominally the operational reserve for the entire sector, had been reduced to just 42 operational tanks after weeks of mechanical issues and fuel shortages. Many vehicles had been immobilized when field mice, seeking warmth in the engine compartments, had chewed through electrical wiring during the bitter cold nights. "Wake all staff officers. I want a full situation report in 15 minutes, Heim ordered, reaching for his binoculars. "And give me a direct line to General Dumitrescu at Romanian 3rd Army headquarters." While Heim attempted to assess the situation 120 kilometers to the southeast, in the ruins of Stalingrad itself, General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German 6th Army, slept soundly in his headquarters bunker. The city had been under siege for months, with German forces controlling 90% of the urban area. Fighting had devolved into a brutal building-by-building struggle that consumed men and material at a frightening rate. But Paulus believed victory was inevitable. His forces had pushed the Soviets back to a narrow strip along the Volga River, and once Stalingrad fell, the 6th Army would secure Hitler's path to the Caucasus oil fields. At 8:30 a.m., Paulus was awakened by his chief of staff, Colonel Arthur Schmidt. "Her General, we've received disturbing reports from the Romanian sectors. The Russians have launched a major offensive." Paulus frowned. "The Russians have attempted localized counterattacks before. I'm sure the Romanians are exaggerating again." Schmidt hesitated. "This appears different, sir. The scale of artillery deployment suggests something much larger. General von Wakes at Army Group B has requested we prepare contingency plans." Paulus waved dismissively. "Tell von Wakes we're fully occupied with taking Stalingrad. The Romanians will have to hold, and Heim's Panzer Corps can deal with any breakthrough." This critical miscalculation would seal the fate of over 250,000 men. At Romanian 3rd Army headquarters, General Petre Dumitrescu was experiencing the collapse of his front in real time. The 48-year-old commander had repeatedly warned German high command about his army's vulnerability. His divisions were spread too thin, covering a 150-kilometer front with inadequate anti-tank weapons and virtually no armor support. His requests for reinforcement had been consistently ignored. When the Soviet barrage began at 7:20 a.m., it fell with devastating precision on Romanian command posts, artillery positions, and communication centers. What followed was even worse. Waves of T-34 tanks, over 900 in total, supported by mechanized infantry. Colonel Mihai Lasker, commanding the Romanian 5th Corps, managed to establish radio contact with Dumitrescu at 9:15 a.m. "General, it's a catastrophe," Lasker reported, the sound of explosions punctuating his transmission. "The 13th Infantry Division is completely shattered. Soviet tanks are penetrating 15 kilometers deep already. We have nothing that can stop them." Dumitrescu immediately contacted Field Marshal Maximilian von Wakes at Army Group B headquarters. "The situation is critical," he reported. "My forces are facing complete annihilation. We need immediate German armored support or the entire front will collapse within hours." Von Wakes, a 61-year-old veteran of both world wars, immediately grasped the strategic implications. Unlike Paulus, he had been concerned about the extended flanks for months. But Hitler had forbidden any withdrawal or strategic realignment, insisting that Stalingrad must fall at all costs. "I am ordering General Heim's Panzer Corps to your sector immediately," von Wakes told Dumitrescu. "Hold as best you can." But Heim's panzers were already too late. Soviet General Nikolai Vatutin's southwest front had achieved complete surprise. By 10:30 a.m., Soviet tank units had penetrated 20 kilometers into Romanian positions. The carefully planned Soviet offensive wasn't just a local counterattack. It was the beginning of a massive double envelopment designed to trap the entire German 6th Army. Major Hans von Doenigny, an intelligence officer with the Abwehr stationed at Army Group B headquarters, had been tracking Soviet force concentrations for weeks. His reports suggesting a major offensive buildup had been repeatedly dismissed by Hitler's headquarters. Now, as reports flooded in confirming his worst fears, he confronted General Hans Krebs, Army Group B's chief of staff. "This is exactly what I warned about," von Doenigny said, pointing to the large wall map where red arrows indicated Soviet breakthroughs. "They've concentrated over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 13,000 artillery pieces for this offensive. Our intelligence estimates were precisely correct." Krebs, a dedicated National Socialist, had previously dismissed these assessments. "The Führer believed the Soviets had exhausted their reserves," he said quietly, the implications of the catastrophic intelligence failure sinking in. "The production capacity of Soviet factories relocated east of the Urals has exceeded our most pessimistic projections," von Doenigny replied. "They're producing 2,000 tanks per month, more than our entire Reich." By noon, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear to German commanders across the southern front. Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Don Front had joined the offensive, attacking from the east. The Soviet plan was now evident, a massive pincer movement aimed at encircling the entire 6th Army. Colonel General Franz Halder, recently dismissed as chief of the German General Staff for his warnings about overextended flanks, received updates from former colleagues still at the front. In his diary that evening, he wrote, "November 19th, 1942. Today marks the beginning of a catastrophe that I have foreseen and warned about for months. The arrogance of leadership and refusal to acknowledge military realities has led us to this moment of crisis." Back at the front, General Heim's Panzer Corps finally engaged Soviet armor near the Chur River at 2:30 p.m. Colonel Hermann von Appeln-Bronikowski led a desperate counterattack with the few operational tanks of the 22nd Panzer Division. "We're facing at least 5 Soviet tank brigades," he radioed to Heim after the initial engagement. "Their T-34s outgun and outmaneuver our Panzer IIIs. Ammunition is running low, and we have fuel for perhaps one more day of operations." The production disparity between Germany and the Soviet Union was now playing out on the battlefield in stark terms. In 1942, Germany produced approximately 4,800 tanks and assault guns for all fronts, while the Soviet Union manufactured over 24,000 tanks, 5 times the German output dedicated solely to the Eastern Front. As the short November day faded into darkness, General Paulus finally began to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported hundreds of Soviet tanks advancing across the steppe. The Romanian Third Army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. At 5:30 p.m., Paulus held an emergency staff meeting. Colonel Schmidt presented the latest situation map, showing Soviet breakthroughs along both flanks. If these advances continue at their current pace, the Soviet forces will link up within 3 days, completely encircling us, Schmidt explained. General Walter von Seydlitz-Gersbach, commanding the LI Army Corps, spoke bluntly. We must break out immediately, tonight, while there's still a corridor west. If we wait for orders from the Führer, it will be too late. Paulus hesitated. Breaking out without Hitler's permission would be a direct violation of standing orders. We'll request permission from High Command to establish a new defensive line west of the Don, he finally decided. The fateful message was sent at 7:15 p.m. The response would not arrive until the following day, by which time the opportunity for escape was rapidly closing. While German commanders debated their options, Soviet planning was proving its sophistication. The offensive had been meticulously organized by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Red Army. Despite having suffered catastrophic defeats earlier in the war, the Soviets had learned, adapted, and now implemented combined arms doctrine with devastating effectiveness. Soviet Lieutenant General Pyotr Belov, commanding a tank corps in the southern Pincer, observed the battlefield transformation firsthand. 2 years ago, we were fighting with tactics from the last war, he told his staff that evening. Today, we are executing a strategic encirclement that Guderian or Manstein themselves would admire. By midnight on November 19th, the Soviet spearheads had advanced up to 45 kilometers, shattering the entire northern flank of the German position. Romanian casualties exceeded 30,000 men in just the first day of fighting. The path to encirclement was wide open. As dawn broke on November 20th, the second phase of Operation Uranus commenced. General Andrei Yeremenko's Stalingrad front attacked the southern flank, held by the Romanian Fourth Army. Like their northern counterparts, these Romanian units lacked adequate anti-tank weapons to counter Soviet armor. General Hans-Georg Lieser, commanding the German 29th Motorized Infantry Division, managed to mount a brief successful counterattack against the southern Soviet advance, but was quickly ordered to pull back to protect the Sixth Army's immediate flank. It was another fateful decision that prioritized the battle for Stalingrad over the strategic threat of encirclement. At 10 a.m. on November 20th, Hitler's response to Paulus's request finally arrived. The Sixth Army will hold its positions. Withdrawal is forbidden. Formation of all-around defense. Further orders will follow. General Karl Strecker, commander of the 11th Army Corps on the northern flank of the Sixth Army, received this directive with dismay. A veteran of the First World War with 40 years of military experience, Strecker immediately recognized the death sentence it represented. This is madness, he told his chief of staff. We are being ordered to create a fortress where none can exist. There are no natural defenses, no prepared positions, no supply caches. We're being ordered to stand and die. Nevertheless, Strecker dutifully began repositioning his forces to form a defensive perimeter, even as Soviet tanks advanced within kilometers of his command post. The industrial disparity between Germany and the Soviet Union was now manifesting in ways that shocked German commanders. Each Soviet tank corps seemed to have unlimited ammunition, while German units were counting individual shells. Soviet infantry attacked with overwhelming numbers, absorbing casualties that would have broken most armies. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Stempel of the 16th Panzer Division witnessed this firsthand as his unit attempted to hold a crossing on the Don River. They kept coming in waves, he later wrote in his diary. We would destroy the first echelon with our remaining ammunition, only to see 3 more appear behind it. Their T-34s would be knocked out, and within hours, new ones would take their place. It was like fighting an industrial process, not an army. By the evening of November 20th, Field Marshal von Wakes at Army Group B headquarters made a last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Against Hitler's direct orders, he instructed Paulus to begin immediate preparations for a breakout attempt to the southwest. The situation demands immediate action, von Wakes' message stated. Within 48 hours, the encirclement will be complete. Army Group B can provide limited air support and attempt to draw off Soviet forces with diversionary attacks. But the Sixth Army must fight its way out now or face destruction. Paulus, caught between conflicting orders from Hitler and his immediate superior, chose to follow the Führer's directive. It was a decision shaped not just by military considerations, but by the Nazi system itself, which had systematically promoted officers who demonstrated personal loyalty to Hitler above those with independent judgment. General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army southwest of Stalingrad, watched the disaster unfold with growing horror. His forces were too distant and too depleted to intervene effectively. In a private letter to his wife written that night, he confessed, "What we are witnessing is not just a tactical defeat, but the collapse of our strategic concept for the entire Eastern Front. The superior production capacity of the Soviets has finally manifested on the battlefield in terms we cannot counter." The industrial statistics supporting Hoth's assessment were staggering. By late 1942, Soviet tank production had reached 2,000 units per month, while German factories struggled to produce 400. Soviet artillery production exceeded German output by a factor of 4. Perhaps most critically, Soviet fuel production from the Baku oil fields, the very objective Hitler had been trying to capture, provided the Red Army with abundant supplies, while German panzer units were rationing every liter. On the northern edge of the developing pocket, the desperate resistance of German and Romanian units continued throughout November 21st. Romanian General Mikhail Lasker gathered remnants of several divisions into a defensive position near Raspopinskaya, hoping for German relief. None would come. Major General Erwin Janek, serving as liaison officer between German and Romanian units, witnessed Lasker's hopeless defense. The Romanians fought with unexpected determination, he later reported. But they were facing a ratio of 10-1 in tanks and artillery. Their obsolete anti-tank rifles might as well have been spears against the T-34s. By the morning of November 22nd, the noose was tightening. Soviet forces were now just 40 kilometers apart. At 6th Army headquarters, Paulus received an extraordinary message from Hitler, elevating him to acting field marshal and designating his forces as Fortress Stalingrad. "The Führer has complete confidence that the 6th Army will hold its positions," the message stated. "Supply by air will be organized. Reinforcements are being prepared." Luftwaffe General Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding the 4th Air Fleet supporting operations at Stalingrad, immediately recognized the impossibility of the air supply promise. His calculations showed that maintaining the 6th Army would require at least 700 tons of supplies daily, far beyond the capacity of available transport aircraft, especially in winter conditions. "This is a death sentence disguised as a decoration," von Richthofen confided to his staff. "Even with perfect weather and no Soviet interference, we could deliver perhaps 250 tons daily. The 6th Army requires at least 700 tons to maintain fighting capability." Yet Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had personally assured Hitler that the air supply operation was feasible. It was another fatal miscalculation based on ideology rather than logistical reality. At 3:30 p.m. on November 23rd, the trap finally closed. Lieutenant Colonel Gian Filipov's 19th Tank Brigade from the Northern Soviet Force captured the bridge at Kalach on the Don River. Hours later, they linked up with elements of Major General V.T. Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps, pushing north from the southern pincer. The encirclement was complete. Inside the pocket were 22 German divisions and remnants of 2 Romanian divisions, approximately 290,000 men in total. They had ammunition for perhaps 2 weeks of combat, food for less than a month, and winter clothing for only a fraction of the troops. Colonel General Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as Germany's most brilliant operational commander, received news of the encirclement while preparing to take command of a newly formed Army Group Don, hastily created to deal with the crisis. Studying the situation maps, he immediately understood the implications. "The production numbers now matter more than tactical brilliance," he told his chief of staff. "The Soviets have created an entirely new army group, fully equipped, while our best formations bleed out in urban combat. This is industrial warfare on a scale we cannot match." Inside the pocket, the reality was setting in for German officers. Lieutenant Colonel Helmut Wells of the 297th Infantry Division summarized the situation in a letter he hoped would reach his family. We entered Russia believing in our tactical and technological superiority. We now find ourselves outproduced, outgunned, and outgeneraled. The factories of the Urals have defeated us as surely as any army. The speed and scale of the Soviet offensive had accomplished more than just a military encirclement. It had shattered the psychological foundation of German strategic thinking. The myth of Slavic inferiority, a cornerstone of Nazi ideology, was collapsing in real time as German officers witnessed the sophistication of Soviet operational art and the overwhelming output of Soviet industry. Field records indicate that on the evening of November 23rd, a remarkable scene unfolded at an artillery observation post of the 76th Infantry Division. Major Wilhelm Koenig, a decorated veteran of the Poland and France campaigns, gathered his junior officers as Soviet forces completed the encirclement. "Gentlemen," he said, pointing to the distant columns of Soviet tanks visible through his binoculars, "what you are witnessing is not just a tactical setback, but a fundamental shift in this war. The Russians are not the primitive horde we were told to expect. They have absorbed every lesson we taught them in 1941 and 1942, and now they are teaching us the true meaning of modern industrial warfare." Among those officers was Lieutenant Peter Ischinger, who would survive the war and later write in his memoirs. November 19th, 1942, was the day the illusion died. We entered Russia believing in our inherent superiority, tactical, technological, even racial. For days later, we stood encircled, watching endless columns of Soviet armor that outnumbered and outclassed our own. The factories had defeated us before the soldiers ever could. The strategic implications extended far beyond Stalingrad. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at the Armed Forces High Command, presented Hitler with a stark assessment on November 24th. The encirclement at Stalingrad locks up 22 divisions that cannot be replaced in the foreseeable future. Our entire southern front is now vulnerable. The initiative in the east has passed to the Soviets. Hitler refused to accept this reality, insisting that a relief operation would break through to the Sixth Army. But the generals knew better. In private conversations documented after the war, they acknowledged that November 19th to 23rd, 1942, marked the irreversible turning point of the Eastern Front. General Gotthard Heinrichsay, who would later distinguish himself in defensive operations against the Red Army, summarized the transformation in a letter to his brother written in December 1942. "We have underestimated not just Soviet manpower, but their industrial capacity, organizational ability, and strategic thinking. The offensive at Stalingrad revealed a level of coordination and planning that matched our best operations from 1940. The war in the East is now unwinnable. For the men trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, 2 more months of increasingly desperate struggle lay ahead. Cold, hunger, and relentless Soviet attacks would reduce their number daily. Of the 290,000 men encircled, fewer than 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The decision-making failures of November 19th to 23rd would be studied for generations as a classic case of strategic blindness. German generals, confronting the reality of Soviet industrial might and operational competence, recognized the war was lost long before the politicians would admit it. As Colonel General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf observed in a post-war interview, the encirclement at Stalingrad wasn't just about losing an army. It was the moment when the mathematical reality of production capacity, resource allocation, and industrial mobilization finally overrode all other factors. You cannot win a modern war when your opponent outproduces you 5-1 in every category of equipment. In the decades that followed, military academies worldwide would study Operation Uranus as a textbook example of operational art, the perfect synchronization of deception, concentration of force, and exploitation of enemy weakness. But for the German generals who lived through those 4 days in November 1942, it represented something more immediate and terrible. The moment they knew, with mathematical certainty, that the war was lost. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.